Dan aktiviti sukuk global dijangka menyederhana pada 2021 susulan tahun yang kukuh pada 2020 menurut laporan Moody's Investor Service. Ini susulan harga minyak mentah global yang mengukuh tahun ini yang akibatkan pengurangan kebergantungan kerajaan GCC kepada pendanaan melalui sukuk. Ia turut menjangka jumlah terbitan tahun ini pada sekitar 190 ke 200 bilion dolar berbanding paras rekod 205 bilion dolar pada 2020. Untuk melihat kepada laporan sukuk separuh pertama 2021 terbitan Moody's Investor Service, saksikan rakaman temu bual saya bersama dengan Naib Presiden Penganalisis Kanan Moody's Investor Service, Ashraf Madani. Ashraf, thank you for joining us. Now, Moody's expects sukuk issuance to be flat or slightly lower this year as higher oil prices have reduced sovereign funding needs in GCC countries. Moody's also expects total gross sukuk issuance in 2021 to reach between 190 and 200 billion dollars versus the 205 billion dollars registered in 2020. Tell us about the rise of issuance in corporate and sovereign in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for this invite, and good morning and good evening to your viewers in Malaysia and across the region. As you said, we're expecting this year to have, slightly lower issuances compared to last year, but in Southeast Asia and particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, we're expecting higher volumes compared to last year. We've seen in the first half numbers some a significant increase in volumes, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, where volumes increased by 22%. And obviously, what we are saying, the favorable operating environment this year compared to last year has pushed some of the corporate, borrowers particularly to go to the market because it's easier to access. On the sovereign side, we're seeing still some fiscal deficits on the sovereign side, supporting the issuance this year, and that's why we saw the increase as well in the first half, and our expectation of continued increase for the second half as well.
Let's talk more about Malaysia, Indonesia a bit later, but Moody's also expects a continued solid sukuk issuance in the second half of the year, driven by increased sovereign activity in both Malaysia and Indonesia, where funding needs remain high. What is happening in these two countries? Is this increase of funding need in these two countries due to measures taken to curb the spread of COVID-19 that went and is still ongoing in these two countries? And also, these two countries are oil-producing countries too, no?
Yes, indeed. They are oil-producing countries, but their pool of revenue is much lower compared to, for instance, the GCC countries, and that's why when, for instance, the COVID-19 hit, both countries had to increase the spending to fight the impact of the COVID-19. Our expectation that the fiscal deficit for this year, will continue to be high and hence require the funding, and sukuk is one alternative to do the funding for these two countries.
Let's focus more on these two countries. Tell us more about the sukuk issued by these two countries. How have they fared so far this year versus the same time last year?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we saw in Southeast Asia, and obviously Indonesia and Malaysia are the largest issuers. Issuance is going up by 22%, which is, we had total volume roughly of around $54 billion in the first half, compared to basically 44 billion last year. And this 54 billion, if you look at the issuance by sector, what's significant is that we've seen the growth across all sectors. And by sector, I'm talking about FIs, I'm talking about corporates, I'm talking about sovereign. So we've seen this happening across all sectors. And as I said, our expectation is that we will continue to see the similar performance in the second half. So roughly, you're talking about more or less another 50 to 55 billion of issuances for the second half of the year.
Do you see the Delta variant as a headwind for recovery in these two countries?
While we have more or less now, we've been living with the COVID for the past 18 months now, so people are more accustomed, but it still remains a downside risk, and it still requires more fiscal spending on this. So the longer that we basically still fight the COVID-19, the longer the fiscal deficit will be high for these two countries.
And new entrants, according to Moody's, new entrants and rising issuance of green sukuk will support long-term growth. Moody's expects this trend to continue. What interesting new green sukuk have we seen so far this year? Who do you think could become the biggest issuance of green sukuk moving forward?
Green Sukuk is an interesting story, to be honest with you. Back in 2017, where we've seen a Malaysian corporate basically leading the way in issuances, the Green Sukuk. Since then, we have, come a long way. Malaysia is the largest basic contributors in terms of number of issuance, but in terms of volume, interestingly, we've seen Indonesia, which was the first sovereign to issue in 2018, and more recently issuances from Saudi Arabia through the Islamic Development Bank, for instance, which had a sizable issuance this year. So we're seeing basically more and more issuers coming to the market. I think Indonesia and Islamic Development Bank in Saudi Arabia currently is in the leading position and trying to market basically this instrument, especially in the Islamic Development Bank. When they had this sizable issue, they're trying to use the funds to promote basically green issuances across the countries under the umbrella of the Islamic Development Bank.
And how have investors responded to the green sukuk issued this year versus last year?
If you look at the ESG, basically, investments, it's in high demand. Everyone wants basically ESG assets, but it's not really the supply side. It's still the issue. So whatever ESG instruments or ESG friendly instruments coming to market, they're being absorbed by investments in a strong way.
Sukuk remains underrepresented in global finance, comprising only 5% of global financial assets versus the Muslim population of around 1.8 billion globally, according to Moody's. What new areas of growth do you see moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, talking about the sukuk, yes, we believe on the long term, the positive trend is still intact, despite our expectation that we might see consolidation this year. But the overall trend, if you look at the issuances between 2010 and 2020, the issuance went up fourfold. We had roughly $50 billion in 2010, and now in 2020, we already surpassed the $200 billion mark. So the trend is positive. And the reason we say that, first of all, every year we have new issuers coming to the market. And this year, for instance, we saw Saudi Aramco, which is a corporate in Saudi Arabia, coming to the market. We saw the government of the Maldives coming to the market. So there is more basically issuance coming to the market. And these issuance are being absorbed by the investors. The instrument itself is becoming more appealing, even for international investors in international countries where Islamic finance doesn't exist. We're seeing these investors, more familiar with the sukuk instrument. I still believe there is quite a bit of room to go. Penetration, like I said, is still low, especially in countries with large Muslim populations. You're talking about, for instance, Indonesia. We're still less than 10%. Turkey, we have, majority Muslim population, and still penetration is under 10%. So the room to grow in these countries is still there.
And coming back to the green sukuk is only about 3% of the total sukuk issued. Do you foresee more green sukuk being issued next year, perhaps supported by the recovery?
Indeed, our expectation, if you look at the growth of the green sukuk, it's still in infancy. So naturally, any growth is expected because we're coming from a very low base. Like I said, since we started in Malaysia in 2017, we're already crossed this year around $7 billion of green sukuk. Our expectation that it will continue to grow. There are some hurdles, especially for the green sukuk, but overall the trend is still positive.
What are these hurdles that you mentioned just now?
First of all, we have a lot of basically issuers that they don't have ESG frameworks in place. So you need to develop these ESG frameworks for these issuers. Some issuers think about basically the added cost of monitoring the green basically guidelines. Once they do the issuance, they have to do the monitoring. So there is the additional added cost that every issuer would think about it, saying, oh, is it really worth it? Not really worth it. Another hurdle, basically, finding the green projects. A lot of the countries that are large in Sukuk issuances are hydrocarbon-based economies. So finding the right project is also another hurdle, stopping the industry from growing to its potential. But hopefully, like I said, we're still expecting numbers to grow year over year.
On that note, thank you very much, Ashraf, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Seterusnya, Presiden Jawatankuasa Antarabangsa Palang Merah menggesa Bank Dunia untuk menamatkan pembekuan dana kepada Afghanistan. Menurut Peter Morris, sekatan berkenaan hanya akan jejaskan sistem kesihatan Afghanistan.
Tambahnya, Palang Merah akan terus bekerjasama dengan kerajaan baru Afghanistan.
Now that they are in government, there is no reason not to continue that engagement and to see how we can respond to ever-increasing needs that we have seen emerging. Temporary stop of the World Bank financing is, of course, affecting the health sector and services delivery in the health sector in Afghanistan prominently. So I would certainly advocate for the bank to look into the best possible way to resume its support for the health facilities in Afghanistan.
Mora membuat kenyataan berkenaan susulan lawatan selama 3 hari ke Afghanistan. Dalam lawatan tersebut, Mora turut bertemu dengan pegawai Taliban dan melawat pusat perubatan, rehabilitasi dan penyakit. Bank Dunia sebelum ini hentikan dana selepas Taliban menguasai negeri itu pada Ogos. Dana berkenaan sebelum itu digunakan untuk bayar kaki tangan perubatan di Afghanistan. Dalam masa yang sama, dana kewangan antarabangsa IMF turut dilaporkan hentikan bantuan kepada negeri itu selepas Taliban melakukan rampasan kuasa.
Dan seterusnya, perbicaraan pengasas Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, bermula pada Rabu. Holmes dituduh menipu pelabur dan pelanggan dan pesakit yang syarikat pemulanya mampu untuk mengubah dunia perubatan.
Holmes sebelum ini dilapor mempunyai kekayaan sekitar $4.5 bilion. Jumlah itu mewakili sekitar 50% pegangannya dalam Theranos. Holmes sebelum ini mendakwa mesinnya mampu untuk mengesan beratus jenis penyakit hanya dengan beberapa titisan darah. Dia turut dakwa kos dan jumlah darah yang diperlukan untuk menguji masalah kesihatan ini adalah jauh lebih sedikit dan lebih pantas berbanding ujian biasa. Holmes turut meraih dana sebanyak $900 juta sebelum kejatuhan Theranos susulan pendedahan Wall Street Journal. Pendedahan tersebut akibatkan siasatan pentadbiran makanan dan ubatan Amerika FDA dan disusuli dengan saman daripada Suruhanjaya Pertukaran dan Sekuriti. Antara yang dijangka turut beri keterangan adalah pelabur dan bekas ahli lembaga pengarah.
Dan kita akan berehat seketika, kembali selepas ini.